Hi, everyone. Hello, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual event with Amanda Gilbert and Sharon Salzberg to discuss Kindness Now, a 28-day guide to living with authenticity, intention, and compassion. Amanda Gilbert is a professor of mindfulness at the University of Southern California, a meditation teacher, speaker, and author. She has been a meditator for over 17 years now and now leads meditation for top companies like NBC, Paramount Pictures, Merrill Lynch, and more. Before dedicating herself to teaching full-time, Amanda was Center Director for the Aging, Metabolism, and Emotion Center at the University of California, San Francisco. She is now an emerging expert in the field of teaching meditation, mindfulness, and the contemplative sciences. Her formal meditation training has been with UCLA's Mindful Awareness Research Center in primordial sound meditation with Deepak Chopra and the Insight meditation tradition. Our moderator today is Sharon Salzberg. Sharon Salzberg is a meditation pioneer, an industry leader, a world-renowned teacher, and a New York Times bestselling author. As one of the first to bring meditation and mindfulness into mainstream American culture over 45 years ago, her relatable, demystifying approach has inspired generations of meditation teachers and wellness influencers. Sharon is co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society and the author of 11 books, including Real Happiness, Loving Kindness, and Real Change. Sharon's secular, modern approach to Buddhist teachings is sought after at schools, conferences, and retreat centers worldwide. Her podcast, The Meta Hour, has amassed over 3 million downloads and features interviews with the top leaders and thinkers of the mindfulness movement and beyond. Sharon's writing can be found on Medium, On Being, the Maria Shriver blog, and the Huffington Post. So a little bit about our event today. Throughout today's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order copies of Kindness Now by pressing the green button below. And that green button also takes you to our shop site where you can order any of Sharon's books as well. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, let me bring Amanda and Sharon to the screen. Hi, Amanda.
Hello.
There we go.
Hello.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Amanda. It's so nice to see you.
It's amazing to see you. I'm honored to be here in this conversation with you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be able to do this. And I wonder if we could just start out where you could talk about being a professor of mindfulness, which is like, I'm old enough and, began teaching so long ago in a way that's kind of funny, my mind.
I feel the exact same way, even just from my scope and my location, presently. And the technical term, actually, even under the university language, is I'm a lecturer of mindfulness at the University of Southern California. However, most broadly, they refer to me and to us as professors of mindfulness. And it's just amazing that that is a title, lecturer, professor, very interchangeable to a certain degree. And it's incredible that mindfulness has gotten into, of course, the mainstream in this way, but it's also being taught in a systematic way in our universities. And I have the great joy of sharing a semester-long mindfulness course with undergraduate students. So people who are at that age of like 20, 21, 22, 23, somewhere in there. And it's incredible to be able to share, especially in the umbrella of the university setting.
That's fantastic. And in reading your book or rereading your book, I was also intrigued by your work in the lab.
Yeah.
And how kind of love and kindness and compassion are being studied in labs as well. So maybe you could say something about that.
Completely. I actually really love that I spent a few years in research and in clinical research on mindfulness and meditation. I was working on behalf of Dr. Alyssa Epple at the Aging Metabolism and Emotion Center. And Alyssa's work is based on stress resilience and understanding how certain contemplative practices or stress reduction practices can help mitigate the effects of stress on the body, on our physiology, and of course on our mental and emotional health and well-being as well. And it's been, I'm so curious to hear what you have to say about this too, because it's been wonderful even as a practitioner, because I identify most as a meditator and a practitioner. I've been meditating well before I started researching and then even studying meditation and mindfulness facilitation more formally, to where I've been teaching for the last few years. And it's incredible to see, even from the empirical standpoint, that we really focused in on mindfulness research for the past many decades. And then I feel like in the last 5, 6, 8, 10 years, we've been starting to research about the heart practices and about loving kindness and compassion and pro-social behavior and altruism. What's your view on that turn of events too?
Oh, well, I was very happy to see that. I greatly admired John Kabat-Zinn, who's at that time, I'm right now I'm in New York City, but the retreat center I co-founded is in Barre, Mass, and Worcester, where John began his work, is not very far from Barre. And so I used to go over there like twice a week, like, what's he up to? And this is so different and yet the same. And I thought he was quite brilliant in sort of the presentation, so that it could be researched, that there was a curriculum and everyone followed it and so on. And I'm sure you would say the same. Teaching in person, there's a human being in front of you and you're kind of mixing things up and bringing in other tools. And it's a little different than that sort of package, that is more applicable for research. But he did an amazing thing in doing that, because for people who have a lot of doubt and it's kind of woo-woo and weird, and there's something actually authentic and verifiable to look at. And it's very reassuring for a lot of people, like, oh, look at this, there's science. So I was very, very happy to see that interest was kind of expanding and that people were more interested in these practices, which we're about to talk about.
Completely agreed. And, part of my practice path was actually moving from mantra-based meditation, which was my doorway into daily practice, and how I actually began to practice Buddhist-based meditation or insight meditation was through the secular world, or through secular mindfulness, through my work in the research lab as well. So I spent many months actually working with Will Kabat-Zinn, John's son, where we were doing a adapted curriculum for some research in San Francisco. And that's really the point where I started to land my practice more fully in mindfulness, and started to study the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and then of course the inherent practices as well. But I find that it's so, to your point, it's so helpful right now to have the empirical backing. And when I first started to teach meditation and mindfulness publicly and more formally after being trained, I found that it was really interesting, because people would hear this little tidbit about my background, like, oh, you helped conduct research on mindfulness and meditation, like, tell me more about that. But then how I was starting to share about the practice, or how I was facilitating sits, I would mention research studies here and there, but the way I was relating to the practice and then sharing the practice, I would only add in some research if I was almost asked to. So it's just very interesting how I think in contemporary times and in present day times, we can, we can find our doorways into Buddhism or Dharma or Buddhist-based practice in these variety of different ways now, especially through secular mindfulness research.
Well, my experience, like, let's say this last 15 months, has been really profound. I spent most of it in Barre, Mass, in my house there, very isolated. Or I should say it didn't feel bad, some more like in solitude. And I have relied on my practice quite a bit. And that goes way back to tools I learned, like 50 years ago. And it's been interesting for me to see how practices like loving kindness, which is really what your book is about, have supported me, in this time, and how I see even the conversation about mindfulness changing, because within mindfulness, the ability to be aware of our experience without berating ourselves, without adding shame, without adding fear, but to just kind of see cleanly and clearly, oh, this is what's happening right now, has within it a tremendous amount of kindness implicit, although not always explicit. And I've seen kind of on the public stage, people struggling to somehow make that clearer. So, the word mindfulness can sound kind of cold and clinical. So I've heard people say like warm mindfulness or kindfulness or loving awareness. And I think, well, you could just call it mindfulness, but let's really talk about these ingredients, like what makes mindfulness. And one of those qualities really is loving kindness. So maybe since there are 4 qualities, which are, all in your book and are the bedrock of this understanding, maybe we could just take them one by one, So loving kindness, or metta, M-E-T-T-A in the Pali language. I don't know if you would like to describe that or explain it more fully.
Yes, and I just love hearing too that you feel like these practices have been so alive in present time, especially just given your scope and background, Sharon. I deeply get it too. I feel like I'm always rediscovering kindfulness or metta or mindfulness, almost every single day in a new way. So metta. I like to think of metta as, of course, metta is the Pali word for loving kindness, like Sharon just mentioned. And it's a way that we can really start to bring in these qualities of the heart. It can translate as kindness or loving kindness into English, loving friendliness. It can translate directly into love. And the way that I invited readers in Kindness Now to start to think about loving kindness was actually through the 3 lenses of metta, which is kindness itself, through love, or through friendliness or friendship. And I know for me in my own practice with metta, it's sometimes kindness, or especially self-kindness, can feel really far away or very foreign and alien and like completely out of reach at certain times. And in those moments, I found it helpful to start to think of metta as friendship. And I would almost start to call to mind a conversation I'd had with a dear friend recently, and notice that feeling in my body of feeling connected to them, or offering them support or empathy or compassion or understanding. And then when I would start to be practicing metta through the lens of friendship, I would actively try to invoke that same quality of offering myself, or offering maybe my difficult person, if I was sending metta towards my difficult person, this same tone of friendship. And same goes with love or loving awareness, like you just mentioned. I really love thinking of metta or loving kindness in this way, because it's inviting us. In your book, Sharon, I mean, your book covers all 4 of these heart qualities as well. And I love in your book, Loving Kindness, you really invite us as meditators and practitioners and readers to think of metta as this unconditional love, not this romanticized love, not the usual way that we think about love, but this more like unconditional, omnipresent, always here, fundamentally always here in the present moment. And I'm going to just paraphrase one of my favorite quotes from your book, Loving Kindness, it's through a loving heart that we can always find our way home, home here in the present moment. And that's a way that I have found that I can access metta, or I also invite the readers in Kindness Now to access metta, is if kindness feels far away, if friendship feels far away, how about inviting ourselves to start to practice loving kindness in the way where, how is love here? What face of love is here? How can I tap into love in this broader, more universal sense?
And do you, what I've run into is that the term loving kindness is so odd for people.
Yeah.
And I've had publishers, for example, say, couldn't you call it compassion? That's a word everyone understands, but certainly if you're referring back to, say, the Buddhist psychology, they're a little bit different, so there's a companion quality of compassion, and maybe you could say something about that.
Yes. And I think it's a practitioner, I'll speak from my own experience. I find that it's been helpful and useful to work with loving kindness and compassion differently, or in an individualized way at different times. A recent way that I've actually been thinking of compassion or sharing about it is that compassion is kindness when it meets suffering. And what I like about that is that when we think of compassion as kindness when it meets suffering, I actually think it gives us the opportunity to start to contemplate loving kindness or metta in a way that is honest and true, especially from the framework of the Buddhist teachings. Because loving kindness or metta, to me in my practice, it is strong, it is courageous, it is fierce, it is hard to do. And I've been noticing that sometimes kindness can kind of get this rap, like it's nice and it's fluffy and, it's very passive. And when we understand that loving kindness or metta is almost like the bedrock, especially through the classical way of teaching the brahma-viharas, or the 4 qualities of the heart, when we start with loving kindness, and then look from loving kindness, when that kindness meets suffering, and then that gives rise to compassion, I feel like that actually gives us a really helpful doorway into working with both metta and karuna, both loving kindness and compassion. What do you think too, Sharon?
I think that is true as well, and I'd say that the 2 biggest controversies I've encountered, in all these years of teaching is, first of all, the idea that kindness, or loving kindness and compassion are weak and weakening, that were we to cultivate them, it's kind of sentimental and gooey, and we, just as you say, we end up passive and just this kind of, I think I have this quotation in Loving Kindness, which came out like 26 years ago, from a former beauty queen, Miss Kentucky. So this was like maybe 30 years after the glory of her reign as Miss Kentucky. And what she said was, I'm so tired of smiling. And you can imagine like 30 years just smiling for the camera with this completely vacuous smile, no presence, no authenticity behind it. And that's people's fear, that these qualities represent that kind of hypocrisy or pretense. And the other great controversy I found is the idea that these qualities can actually be trained or cultivated. Yeah. I think something like compassion, maybe we think of it, I don't know, I've pondered this a lot, maybe we think of it as kind of a gift, and you either have it or you don't, and if you don't have it, you're out of luck, but really from the Eastern point of view, or you could say from the Buddhist point of view, these things are completely trainable because they are like emergent properties of the way we pay attention. Mm-hmm. If you're meeting somebody and somebody told you something about them and you're holding that fixed idea in your mind and you're not really listening and you're not really taking them in, you're not creating the conditions where a sense of connection can arise. But if we pay attention fully and we really listen and we're really present, then we are creating those conditions, and so they can come. And certainly the flavor of compassion and loving kindness is a little different, because just as you say, the compassion is looking at our vulnerability to suffering and to change. And so it's got a certain poignancy to it, a certain feeling to it.
Completely. And I find that compassion is something that I feel like, especially as modern day meditators, I've been finding that people like to think of compassion as a very actionable quality. That, and what I love about this framework too is that when we practice compassion in an active way, it doesn't mean we always have to be out doing something or in the act of taking a compassionate stance, which of course, though, that is a very important way to practice compassion, is being in action around our values and standing up for injustice and what it is we want to see in the world and hope to see in the world. And we can actually even almost tiptoe up to that if we're like not quite there or centered in that sort of compassionate outward stance. We can think of compassion as sitting next to somebody in their difficult moment, or we can understand that compassion. And Thich Nhat Hanh, I think a lot of his work is beautifully describes this, is that, he says, if you're sitting alongside somebody in their suffering or in their moment of challenge or strife, and maybe not even saying anything, like you were just saying, like deep listening, that's compassion too, because it's almost like we are opening up our hearts and we're willing to be in that state of discomfort. I think compassion is really, it comes into play when we are uncomfortable or when the circumstances are uncomfortable too. And one thing I say in Kindness Now, and I almost like, I say this with so much joy and so much compassion and understanding, that the heart practices aren't for the faint of heart at times. I know that's been the case for me in my own experience of practicing with loving kindness and compassion, and definitely appreciative joy for sure. It takes a lot of determination, a lot of willingness. It's not easy to sit in our own suffering or even to be with others in their moments of need or suffering as well.
Yeah, I loved when you said that. What a great reminder, like, and I want to go on to talk about the next two qualities, but just before we do, I'm very curious, like, given the nature of the publishing industry and how long before pub date one actually turns in a book, I'm very curious about when you wrote this in terms of timing, the pandemic, the marches, the traumas of our time.
Thank you for asking us, Sharon, because it's something that is really alive and present for me now that the book is released. And I loved hearing what you were up to in 2020, also in solitude, in retreat. I was doing the same thing, and I actually started writing Kindness Now the week that we all went on lockdown here in the US. So I started writing in March, and then I almost have to like reopen my calendar last year just to speak totally, poignantly about this timetable. But from my recapitulation of the writing process last year, I was writing the week of practices on loving kindness in March, when we were all asked to understand what COVID was for the first time, and we were all understanding the magnitude of the pandemic. And then when I started to write about compassion, week 2, teachings on compassion, that's when we all went through the immense sorrow and pain of George Floyd's murder. And the marches, of course, ensued. And that was so alive for me during my teachings. I was my writing of the teachings of loving kindness and compassion, those 2 weeks. I was in solitude also, just in this cabin in the middle of Topanga, California. And I was checking, of course, the news and the media multiple times a day, but I was also having to keep like my writing container as intact as possible. which was very important to me also, but I was still holding the sorrow and the heartbreak of the world, of George Floyd's murder, the ramifications of that, and of course the trauma of the pandemic. And then here's what I want to double check at some point really soon too, is when I started to write about mudita, about appreciative joy, I remember that it was very close to around the time where the officers were acquitted or not acquitted, but they were charged for George Floyd's murder. So there was almost like this relief that started to happen a little bit, and people were started to not celebrate that, of course, but there was this moment of understanding, like, okay, there's going to be responsibility here, and there's going to be accountability, perhaps. So we started down that journey. And then week 4, teachings on equanimity, I landed on that late summer, early fall of 2020, when the first mentions of the vaccines were starting to come out, and we were sort of like in our pandemic, not civility, but we were understanding what it meant to be in COVID and in 2020 at that point. So kindness now really mirrored the actual events of 2020, I feel like, in a very specific way, a very synchronistic way. I was pretty much in awe that I, as the practitioner and writer, was really relying on these practices in real time. And just all of the circumstances and events of 2020 were also just so present and being funneled into how I was writing about the 4 heart qualities.
It's so interesting, really fascinating, is because it easily, I mean, I wrote, my most recent book was Real Change, and I wrote every word of it before the pandemic, except for the preface, because the publication was delayed. And so that gave me time to write a new preface, but it was like, you know. And yet, you know, the thing that guided me, and I think it guided you, you know, seeing the quality of what you did, which is really good. And the thing that guided me was this question of, like, what's still true?
Yes.
You know, like, what am I counting on? What's holding me up? What am I relying on? Like, I'm very conscious that even though people are tuning in from everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
you know, my experience of books and books is in Miami, which is a fantastic site, and someplace, you know, sometime in this lifetime, I hope to get back to. And you know, my more recent experiences of that region are, you know, Parkland school shooting, you know, in that community, where I now have, you know, different connections, and of course this building crumbling, you know, and having friends who live not far from there. And so I ask myself that question about those tools, even here. You know, can this still be relevant? And I, for myself, certainly came back all the time with, yes, this is what I'm counting on. And so that's what I put in the preface. So it would be interesting to contemplate writing during, you know, this whole flow of events. So let's talk about appreciative joy, which is the next of these 4 qualities. People sometimes say, like, I've had teachers say that of the 4, appreciative joy or sympathetic joy is often the most difficult for us to experience, which is kind of interesting. Like, what's your experience of that?
So appreciative joy, sympathetic joy, empathetic joy, mudita has been like my heart practice of the moment the last few years. And I do agree with that idea and that sentiment, because mudita, when we are asked to really, really, as genuinely as possible, be happy for someone else's happiness, or happy for someone else's success or good fortune or prosperity, that will stretch our hearts at times. That will really ask so much of us. And we also notice where we're obstructed, where we're blocked in our capacity to genuinely rejoice for somebody else's happiness. So I think, you know, my experience firsthand is that it's illuminating. Mudita is confronting, it's illuminating. it kind of shows us where we are feeling blocked with our ability to be centered in our open-heartedness, or to be connected to that true nature of open-heartedness. And however, I also feel like it is a practice of the time for us, because especially just being on the social media landscape, and especially since we've all been online so much in 2020 and now into 2021. I mean, we're hosting this event online, and and having this moment with Books and Books online. I feel like there's so much opportunity to practice appreciative joy and mudita, because so much of what we see online is curated, obviously, and everybody's highlight reels. So I agree with that. It's a difficult practice, but I also feel like it's one of the most useful and helpful practices for us to deal with our very personal, painful feelings around jealousy and comparison and envy and all that.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And the thing that always struck me, well, two things. One is, I think we all probably know people who have that quality just naturally, like something good happens for you and they're so happy for you and it feels so wonderful. And for most of us, it's not that natural, it's not the inevitable reaction. And so again, it's a question of training, not, the word training is a little harsh maybe, but it's not an overlay of something hypocritical that you're not really feeling on top of these roiling, feelings of jealousy. But it's learning how to pay attention differently. And in the case of sympathetic joy or appreciative joy, what I found is it's really confronting a lot of assumptions, like the idea like you have everything and you will forever, and I have nothing and I will forever. So of course there's several problems with that, like nothing is forever.
Right.
And it's unlikely I have absolutely nothing. It's more likely I may have nothing much I'm paying attention to or appreciating. It's also unlikely you have absolutely everything, but our mind kind of goes there out of habit, and being able to dismantle that is really the key to actually being happy for someone else's happiness.
I love that you keep bringing us back to that. You can train these qualities of the heart, just like we can train our minds to be in the present moment. And I think that's really important for us as practitioners, or for readers, to just take in for a moment, because we think that, like Sharon has mentioned, that these qualities might be out of reach, that our biases, our conditioning is too baked into us to be able to pierce through or see through. But if we actually approach our heart practice, our practices of kindness and rejoicing and compassion and equanimity, in the same way where we are wanting to learn how to live our lives in the present moment, I just feel like that's part of the current call of the times. At least of course, I just wrote a book presently on the brahma-viharas, so that's a biased opinion in itself. But I just really feel like if we can take that in, that we can train to come back to our original open-heartedness through these 4 heart practices. I mean, let's do that. Let's really show up and practice these heart qualities in a very diligent, specific way.
Okay, so equanimity after loving kindness, compassion, and appreciative joy. Well, I mean, when I first heard that, formulation, I thought, what's that doing there? Like, I could see the kind of emotional connection of the first 3, but equanimity, well, of course, I didn't understand what it was anyway. But, it's so easy to confuse equanimity with indifference or coldness, which it's not. But it was only later that I came to understand why that fits in that particular bundle.
Yeah. I want to hear that from you, Sharon. I'll just add in, I had a very similar experience, because to me, when I first started to practice insight meditation, and my practice shifted from mantra-based meditation to mindfulness and insight meditation, one of my first personal outcomes was equanimity. And so I actually got to know equanimity through beautiful, basic mindfulness. And I just, want to say too that the first many, many years of my mindfulness or insight or Buddhist-based practice was just in the richness of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Like I was really good in that terrain for quite a bit of time. And it wasn't until I was introduced to loving kindness where that flavor of love started to really be highlighted in my practice. But I first got to know equanimity through mindfulness, creating a little bit of stability or evenness of mind. And then as it pertains in the 4 heart qualities, I have found through looking at equanimity in that lens that it's almost like the cooling agent for the other 3, because from the lens of my practice, kindness, compassion, and appreciative joy, they have a lot of like energy to them, or they have a lot of heat and a lot of warmth, or they require a lot of us. They ask a lot of us at times. And then equanimity is almost like the yin to the other 3 heart qualities, like yang. It gives us this ability to step back and to almost create this foundation of loving awareness. Again, mindfulness is so it's so intertwined in equanimity. It leads to it and lends to it so much. And equanimity gives us this chance to create a balanced state of awareness where we can start to see where we need to almost place our metta, our karuna, or our appreciative joy at times. And it also creates sustainability. Like I feel like if I wasn't able to rest in the abode of equanimity, even in a moment of like when I'm actively practicing compassion, it just might become a lot. We might go into compassion burnout or compassion fatigue a little bit more easily and quickly. What's your view on this though, Sharon? I'm so curious.
Yeah, no, it's very much like yours. I think I came to try to define equanimity as the balance born from wisdom.
Yeah.
So it's like spaciousness. I like coolness. It's not coldness, but it's like space, and we need that wisdom. It's like any compassionate act, I think, inevitably involves our own discomfort, our wish to be in control, our wanting to be the savior, whatever, some other agenda. And we need the balance and the wisdom to say, I will do everything I can, and it's not in my hands ultimately. Wish that it was, but it's not that way. And so I think sustainability is a fantastic way of describing it. So I know we have to open up to questions, and I'm really eager to. I just wanted to say congratulations, and both the combination of the meditation practices, the journaling, the emphasis on authenticity, I think make for a really wonderful book. So.
Sharon, that means the world coming from you.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. Hi, Caroline.
Hi. Okay. So we do have some time for some questions. Let's see. And Sharon, I'm sure you're, welcome to jump in on these, give your own perspective. Okay. Who is this book for? Is it okay for beginners and people who haven't practiced mindfulness before?
Absolutely. One of my intentions for writing this was to share about the heart practices of mindfulness meditation, or the brahma-viharas in present time, but also coming from the lens of I kept getting asked the question quite a bit from people who had been exposed to meditation or who had kind of gotten their footing in the practice of mindfulness meditation of what's next. I'm becoming more aware of my inner world, more aware of my monkey mind, more aware of my difficult, painful emotions. So what do I do with all this knowledge and self-awareness? And to me, and even coming back to some traditional view on meditation or Buddhist-based practice, which is we're constantly working with these 2 wings of our practice, the wing of wisdom and awareness, and the wing of the heart and compassion. And so I really wanted to, put the spotlight on the heart for us as modern day meditators. With that being said, if you have never meditated before, like Sharon and I have been talking about, mindfulness and metta, at the end of the day, they come from the same place. We're learning how to place our attention in the present moment in a loving way. So if you're brand new to mindfulness meditation, we practice mindfulness at the beginning of each day's practice. There's a big foundation of mindfulness meditation as part of the book. So it's for beginners, and it's also for people who have a practice or are really ready to learn about the heart practices in a more systematic way.
Yeah, I would say also that one thing that of the many things that are really good about the book is that I think there's a real honesty about some of the difficulties along the way, which certainly when I was a beginner meditator, that was the most reassuring thing of all. I thought, oh, I want to hear another talk on sleepiness, like I don't want to hear about bliss, like just because I'm not having any bliss, like tell me I'm okay, and I think there's a lot of that in there.
Thanks, Sharon.
And this next one is kind of in the same vein. What are some practical ways I can incorporate kindness into my everyday?
I'm so curious to hear what Sharon has to say about this. What I love so much about the heart practices is that and mindfulness, of course, is that we can train in our mindfulness practice and in our heart practice, in our formal sitting meditation, like we've been talking about. But we're really doing this so we can live with these qualities moment to moment during our days. So there are specific, mobile, actionable practices for each of the 4 heart qualities. And part of each day in Kindness Now, part of the 28 days, is ending each day with this like mobilized suggestion, like take this metta out with you into the day, take this compassion out with you into the day, put it into action. And so one of my favorite go-to ways to practice with kindness moment to moment during my days is to actually repeat metta phrases in my mind as I'm meeting situations, meeting people, if I'm waiting in line at my local tea shop. And I notice like somebody may be a little bit like stressed out because the line is moving really slow right in front of me. I'll drop into my metta practice. And of course, my mindfulness at the same time, I'll bring my attention to my feet resting against the floor. I even do a little covert metta, like in compassion. I place my hand over my heart just in line. Maybe people notice, maybe they don't. And then I start sending phrases. May I meet this too with kindness towards myself and towards the other person. May your day start to unfold with ease. May you remember the love that you are. So our metta is so malleable. It's so able to be applied moment to moment. So the phrases in particular, metta phrases, I find are very, very wonderful techniques to bring with us out into our day-to-day. Sharon, what do you think? What's some of your go-to kindness practices?
And I'll tell you what I've been practicing during this last period, because I think the most important thing, which you cover really well in your book and thoroughly, is wanting to have, it's having the motivation or the intention. So I decided I was going to try to use that period, which I thought was going to last 2 weeks and lasted 15 months, as a time to be kinder. And so I would do things like resolve not to press send on the email right away, but to write it out, take a few breaths, read it again, and decide if maybe there were impressions I was giving that weren't really right, or people might take it the wrong way, and just to be kinder. So I'd rewrite it.
I love that. And I love what you said about, these phrases being touchstones. And I think this, we'll end on this question because I think it's a great question. What books influenced you when you were writing Kindness Now? I think books can also be touchstones. So Sharon, I'm sure we'd love to hear what books have influenced you as well.
I love this question. Thank you to whoever asked this, because I'm a big book person. This is why I was so excited to work with you, Caroline, at Books and Books, and have Sharon and I's conversation be with you. Is books have been a refuge for me over the course of my life. There's been like 3 to 6 books, many of them Dharma books, which are dog-eared, underlined, worn from suitcase travel. They have been on my bedside, they have been cushion side just over the course of some really challenging moments in my life. So the way I relate to books, and specifically some practice books, is they have been that lifeline back to the heart, or to healing, or to reassurance. So, of course, part of my inspiration for Kindness Now was Sharon's book, Loving Kindness. I just kind of had it up in my space, and I've always considered Loving Kindness the go-to book for us as meditators. It's been on my cushion, by my cushion for years. And I was also really doing a lot of study on the Buddhist teachings on the Dhammapada at that time, some very classical work in Buddha's earliest teachings. And I also really, really value When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chödrön as well. So that's been a book that's been very present inside for me for years. And I'm also trying to think of what was present for me last year. Oh, Ajahn Chah. His books and his work was just really out in my space, and I really felt his presence quite a bit when I was writing.
Well, those are all great. I know Pema Chödrön book is bestseller of books and books, been bestseller for many years. Sharon, do you have any bookmarks you'd like to share?
There's so many, Pema, of course, and I think probably the most significant book for me, and years and years ago, was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and it's a very, very simple book, and it's got really cute little illustrations, and I think in part was because I was very naive, and I first saw the title and I thought, oh, I know what that's about. You start out with this really awkward beginner's mind, and you work hard, and you get like a Zen mind, and I didn't actually buy the book. And then somebody sent it to me when I was in India, and books were extremely precious and rare in English. And I read the book and I thought, oh, it's the opposite. Look at that, so it completely undermined all of my assumptions, which was a very good thing.
Well, I think we'll all add those to our to-be-read lists. Thank you so much. This was such a great conversation, so enlightening, so inspiring. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone in the audience who joined us on their lunch hour or whenever. We really appreciate it. And if you haven't purchased your copy of Kindness Now, you can do so by clicking the green button below. And of course, we appreciate each and every purchase. So thank you guys so much. And hopefully we'll see you at our next virtual event.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Have a good day.